with you as a data-driven marketer, how do you kind of think about trying to put metrics to things like brand, like design, like feeling or connection or something like that? Like, how do you think about the idea of like everything should be measurable on one extreme to like marketing is about creating a feeling? Where's the sweet spot, and how do you kind of address all of those?
So it's interesting because there has been like a pendulum shift, right? And so there was a period of time, especially with why e-commerce was so like great and kind of grew and like everyone was so excited about it is because like everything was so measurable, right? You could able to go Google Analytics or whatever your platform was, you'd be able to see what the conversion rate was, seeing what the ROAS is. But it also forced us and put us in a position where like we valued and overvalued things that were easily measurable, right? And so because it was easily measurable, because it was being able to get captured, so like it was like, oh, okay, this, our CAC is this, our ROAS is this, and we just solely emphasized it to the point that we weren't willing to do anything if it didn't have immediate like return on ad spend or return ROI that we can calculate. So which is great in the short term because like you're optimizing for conversion, you're getting all the things that are bringing in the money today, but then all these brands reach a stalemate when like they haven't been building and cultivating a relationship and they haven't been building the pipeline for a year or several months.
I'm Amy Syed.
I'm Sean Collins.
And this is Numbers and Narratives.
Okay, great. Temi, it's so great to have you on the podcast today. For all our listeners who might not know you, can you give a quick rundown on your background and what you're working on now?
Hi, I'm Temi. I pretty much have been a marketer for most of my career. I actually started my career traditionally in retail at Lord & Taylor. And then for the past 15 years, I've been primarily in e-commerce. Run the gamut in terms of working at Estée Lauder, working on the Estée Lauder brand for about 7 years. And then I made a pivot about, I want to say 7 years ago to working at growth startups. So working at companies like Swell, was at Love Wellness, most recently at Jobs, and really pretty much overseeing the direct-to-consumer channel and e-commerce. A lot of that included both e-commerce as well as Amazon, owning the overall P&L, thinking about all aspects of the customer journey from acquisition, retention, as well as CRO. And most recently, about a little under a year ago, I became independent. And so working as a fractional marketing executive and advisor, primarily focused on VC, PE-backed brands, DVC-first brands, and doing a lot of what I did in-house full-time and doing it on a fractional basis.
That's so cool. And so you've really run the gamut then on focus areas for e-com, right? Where you've done kind of wellness and health. You've done kind of novel products. I think Drops is just a fascinating deviation, and then Estée Lauder, which has so many products, and you've done acquisition, retention, and CRO. So when you kind of come into these new engagements as a consultant or a fractional leader, where do you normally, how does that process kick off? Where do you normally start? Do they know what they're coming to you for specifically, or do you kind of do your own assessment and go from there?
So it varies. And so it's interesting because while I've run the gamut across my career, I actually started my career traditionally in retention. And so that's where I spent foundationally. That was my introduction to marketing. And so it varies based on the needs of the brand, whether it be an advisory capacity or in terms of like pitching for services. Sometimes they don't know, sometimes it's like we don't have a marketing leader in place. And so we need kind of help in terms of looking at optimizing our customer journey. And so without get behind the whistle, like what that looks like, to understand whether it's focusing on acquisition, whether it's focusing on retention, or all of those things. And then sometimes what's interesting is like when I made the pivot to be independent, I had a lot of conversations with like pre-market brands. And so we're in an age where like when someone's launching a brand, their usual first foray to do it is to launch a website. And so that's kind of their first kind of introduction to launching their brand. And so if they don't necessarily have the direct experience there, they're looking for someone to kind of help them with their go-to-market strategy in terms of launching their brand to market.
That's really fascinating. So when you're working in kind of that last bit of kind of the pre-product brand, is it a lot of testing, ads and landing pages to find out what the right positioning is, right? What the right value prop is, and you're driving to some sort of like lead capture form?
Yeah, so it's some level of lead capture, and it's also like what is the budget, and like what do they have the money to actually support? But a lot of it is actually the brand positioning, right? Because if you think about any kind of category, whether you're in beauty, health and wellness, or any kind of category that exists, and currently there's a lot in the marketplace, right? There's a lot in brands, and so how do you kind of break through the noise? And a huge portion of that is brand positioning, and like how are you kind of differentiating yourself, and how are you solving a problem for a customer? And so that is, the creative. That's also where your customers, how do you play where they are? How do you kind of break through the noise of all that's out there? And especially like if you think about it, like going back to even when I was at full time at jobs, right? So for the most part, everyone does their laundry, right? In some kind of capacity. People do their dishes, right? So they already have a product that they're using. And so essentially you're trying to get them to change whatever product that they're currently using. And so how do you position that for people who are in the area of like kind of changing their product, being concerned about the ingredients that are in their product and kind of making sure that you capture that attention versus something where in health and wellness, not everyone takes supplements, right? And so, like, you're adapting to people who may already be taking supplements and try and change that. But then it's also how do you get people to like have supplements as part of their kind of overall health journey, and have it solve a problem that they may have.
And so you said most of the companies you work with are venture backed, right? So they have some level of capital to kind of put into this testing process.
It depends. Some of them are bootstrapped as well. So, like, the primary sweet spot for me is ones that have venture backed. But since I mean, this is a fairly new journey for me as I've become independent. And so, finding tuning who like my ideal customer profile is and who I work with. But I've gotten a lot of people who have been bootstrapped. So they're self-funded or they're in a process of raising pre-seed funding. And so they need a lot of it has been like advisory. Like, how do you kind of advise me in terms of how I approach launching my product, what kind of plan will look like? Um, and then some levels of it is in terms of conversations that I have in terms of pitching my services are VC and PE back because they have the funding to actually support some on an ongoing basis versus a project basis.
Sure. Okay. And so how different does that sort of positioning, exploration, and validation or testing, how different does that look for a bootstrap brand that might be a little tighter on cash versus, a funded company who's got a little bit more runway to go?
Well, it's different, but it's kind of similar. So, like, they still kind of require you to be scrappy, right? So, like, when there's level of funding there, there's still expectations of kind of having metrics and KPIs that tie to it. And so, Bootstrap, they're probably a little more scrappy in terms of there's a lot more emphasis on organic and less on the paid things just because they're trying to prove product market fit. They don't have that yet. They're not even in market yet. And so, there's more of like a conservative approach in terms of like, how I advise those situations and how they kind of at least scale, thinking about like their first, 30, 60, 90 days in terms of being in market versus companies that are some level of funding. But even then, like when things are VC and PE back, they also want to return their dollar, right? So, so there's different ways of being scrappy. You just have a little more leeway in that arena.
Can you give me like a couple examples of like what might a scrappy the conservative scrappy way versus the less conservative or maybe aggressive scrappy way? Like what is some of these tactics that you're rolling out look like?
So it depends. So like so in the scrappy way is like, as I kind of mentioned, focusing on the organic. So that's kind of lead capture, leveraging kind of channels that you own. Email is part of that. Organic social is kind of way to lead gen, but also playing in places, whether it's I think I haven't really tested as much this way, but like I do think Substack is definitely a channel that's kind of grown in terms of allowing brands to kind of have a connection to consumers that doesn't necessarily cost them as much. And I think is one of the channels I actually really watch because I think it'll be interesting how it kind of changes and evolves in terms of having a pay component because obviously there isn't a formal pay component there. Affiliate PR is another avenue. I had conversations with brands in terms of leveraging that between listicles and getting placement and getting 'cause these are things that kind of live ongoing, right? Versus like traditional like Meta is like an ad list for if even it's doing well, it could live for maybe 2 or 3 weeks before you have to replace it, right? And so things that kind of are ongoing and living that you kind of nurture the relationship. And so that helps in terms of generating leads and then you're kind of focused on converting them. Now on the flip side, if you have a little more venture backing, you have a little more leeway to spend more money, then it's like you're testing a lot more creative on Meta. You're playing in pretty much in Google and Meta arena. You're having a little more money to do it, leverage influencers at scale. And so those are the things, but the expectations of growth are different, that arena. So like I would say in my experience, um, outside of consulting, but just more so in the full-time capacity. Most of the brands, especially growth startups that I've worked on, have been some level of VC or PE funded. And so there's more money to kind of spend and test in those arenas, and there's more appetite to test things, fail quickly, and then learn from them and adjust. Versus when you're kind of working very scrappy, it's very much the tried and true, which can kind of bring enough without necessarily costing a lot, at least in initial kind of stages of a brand launching.
I started it was an app and now also a consultancy last year, and very much resonate with the need to figure out the channels where you're comfortable and kind of already have an audience or already have some presence, because money's tight when you go out on your own and they're striking you, and I don't even have to buy a product. So if you're an e-com brand trying to also figure out how you're going to pay for Shopify and your logistics and your ads and your acquisition, like you do have to be very cautious there of not overreaching.
Oh yeah. So I would say also one other avenue is that Reddit is actually a good resource if you have the time to kind of search it to figure out if you are a product that solves a problem, figuring out how people are talking about it, what brands are talking about to solve it, what are the kind of pain points. And so that's kind of like a free thing to kind of search to kind of get insights before, even if you're a brand that's existing, but also if you're launching a brand, it's well, how are potential customers or people who are in the area that potentially could use your products, how are they actually talking about the issue that they have or the challenges that they have with the current brands that they're using? And that gives you kind of a sweet spot to kind of tailor your messaging to kind of solve those pain points. Now, there is an area where brands have or there's fake people who are people who work for the brand who will go on Reddit and respond to things, which is very noticeable. But I think Reddit still kind of maintains a level of authenticity, which people are comfortable kind of talking about their product issues or any of those type of things. So it's definitely a good kind of research tool to even start off that's more or less free to kind of understand the landscape.
Yeah, I like that. And at my last company, there were some skeptics about Reddit and I guess how representative power users on Reddit are compared to sort of your core demographic or kind of people who are going to find you via Instagram are not necessarily the exact same people who are going to be on Reddit. And so how do you kind of think about in the software side, there's the book Crossing the Chasm that talks about kind of early adopters and how those are so different from the mainstream eventual customers, and then you're going to cross this chasm and find your sustainable growth and your long time audience. How do you think, is there a similar kind of structure for an e-com brand where you're going to have early adopters who are not necessarily representative, but you can kind of build a foothold with? Or do you think that for a skincare brand or a fashion brand, maybe there's less skepticism or something, and so the audience is more representative right away?
So I think when you're launching a new brand, there's always going to be early adopters, but those are the people most prime and are in the market for whatever you're selling, right? So either they're people who just purchase things on a regular basis and they just like to try new things, or they're looking for a solution that kind of adapts to what it be. So we're talking about the world of hair care. People use some product for their hair, but there's also constant kind of churn in people trying different hair care products. It's they want something that's going to be the holy grail for them to use, right? And so the early adopters are people just primarily in the market. And as a brand kind of matures, then it's harder to kind of convert other people across the funnel. And the same messaging doesn't really resonate. So the message that resonates in the beginning when you launch a brand kind of has to evolve to kind of touch the touch points. But it's also the nurture cycle is a lot longer, right? So when you kind of launch a brand, you're easy to kind of convert those customers. And easy is relative. So let's say a couple of months, it's easier to convert them because they're people that you're addressing a very immediate need. They're in the market to buy your products. As you kind of mature, people are less in the market and kind of expand and kind of scale. People are less in the market. And so it requires a lot more nurturing to kind of show the value add that you have, show how, and it's more towards the branding. And when I say branding, I mean sort of at the end of the day, any product that you sell, there are multiple products to do the same thing. Like in some way they solve the same kind of problem. And so why people choose your product is more tied to the actual brand and less about the functional aspects of it. And so that requires a lot of nurturing of the relationship with the customer, for them to have an affiliation with the brand as the brand kind of matures. So I think like the messaging that you start off with when you launch is going to be good enough to kind of get the initial customers, but part of like working on a brand, especially in e-commerce, is being able to kind of evolve that over time, and evolve that with the needs of like the different tiers of segments that you're across the cycle, like as you more matured as a brand.
Yeah, I like that. It reminds me, I was watching a video someone on Ibby's team made. They have a product that looks at like voice of the customer by scraping reviews and analyzing your reviews. And they did one for Stanley mugs. And it was funny. 'Cause, I mean, I guess the trend's kind of died off now, but there was like such a trend on Instagram last year around the Stanley mug. And so they scraped the reviews, and almost 50% of the reviews cited either Instagram or the brand in general as the reason they bought. And only like in less than half of the reviews we're talking about a product feature or like something distinct. Like that's so, I think it's so fascinating because we spend so much time obsessing on product details when you're brand side, whether it's an e-commerce product or an app or whatever. And then you find out that almost half of the power is just how you package it, how you make people feel, how you build a connection and communicate it. Um, Even as a marketer, that still blows my mind that 50% of the reviews were just about Instagram and the brand feel.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about Stanley because, like, when I was at Swell, it's a similar thing, right? Because, like, you had all these other brands. You had Yeti, you had Hydro Flask, and so they all were in varying levels in the same functionality. They kept things hot, they kept things cold. Um, and so, like, one of the things I worked on is, like, the repositioning of what actually Swell is. And so less about the functionality. It's like it's a fashion accessory. It has different prints. It's colorful. It's something that stands out when you go to yoga class or you're exercising. It's very noticeable when you're on the subway or traveling. And so it's less about the functional aspect. It's more about it is a women-founded brand. And so all those kind of components of what attach people's kind of affiliation to Swell, like leading into that versus like, oh, it keeps things hot. I mean, yes, that's cool and great, but like we're not the only brand that keeps things hot and cold. And so leaning more into like the more aesthetic of what the brand represents and the connection to it, and it just being almost like a luxury fashion accessory versus kind of the kind of staple kind of colors that you would get from like Yeti and Hydro Flask.
I never thought about that. That's really interesting. So to kind of pull that back to what we were just talking about with the validating positioning side of things, like you obviously aren't really going to have a brand and a connection in the same way when you're just launching a product, right? So is part of that transition from, nascency to maturity, almost moving from talking about the product and the feature or the pain point to like someday we're just talking about being a luxury item that you feel cool bringing with you to yoga or whatever? Or do you think you need to start or should start emphasizing sort of those connection points and building the brand from day zero?
I think it actually needs to kind of start talking about brand from the beginning. I don't necessarily think it needs to be as heavily weighted as like your brand matures, but I do think that you need the element there. Now, that being said, it depends on what kind of category you're in, right? And so when you're launching, because are you disrupting in a way that like you actually have to explain why people should use your product? Or is like, are there competitors already space and people have a general understanding of, what your product is and you don't have to spend that much time explaining the functionality of it. And so it's almost like you lead first with the brand and then come with the functionality second. And the branding connection there. But the thing is, when you're kind of launching in the early stages, like you may not actually understand. You have a position on what your brand positioning is before you launch, but that's going to kind of change and tailor based on the realities of like what's on the market and how people react to your products, right? And so, but I do think even, especially now, like especially if you think about e-commerce, like there's so many websites, there's so many places for you to buy something online. And there's almost every brand has its own kind of direct consumer website, and so branding is actually more important in that instance because like like or even think about this. So we're talking about Poppy, right? Like there's multiple prebiotic sodas that exist in the market, right? And so like the brand is pretty much, and they all pretty much all came around at the same time, right? And so how do you kind of distinguish between the noise? So that's why I think you do still need level up brand. It's less important in the early stages, but I do think when you're launching a new brand, like you have to have some component of the branding and brand positioning. And as I mentioned, lead with the brand and come with the functionality second.
Last question on this one, probably. But so as you're kind of testing these out, right? Like you're going to get some sort of signal and validation likely for a few different, whether it's audiences, maybe you ran a test for like, hey, we're going to go after this batch of creative and positioning is going to be like the primary buyer is single moms in the Midwest. And then we're also going to run a version that's going to be, yoga fans in New York and LA. If you got high engagement with multiple positions and multiple audiences, do you then have to go and do like, what is that analysis to kind of pick the winner if you have some sort of positive indication from multiple directions?
I don't think there's a picking the winner. If both of them kind of resonate, then it's more about like the messaging that you have different messaging for different consumer segments, right? And so you're thinking about it in that way versus like having to have one central messaging. Now, there is one way where like you can kind of combine the two if you want to, if you're able to kind of create a simple message that tracks to both. But I look at it more of like you leveraging that as different ways to kind of segment. So like an example that I would use is like when I was at Drops, right? So there's a portion of the customers that really care about the sustainability, care about the ingredients. They want to be eco-friendly and those type of things. But there's also customers who are like new parents who just have kids who have sensitivity to fragrance, right? And so because of that, they get introduced to Drops in that avenue, right? So they may not necessarily care as much about the sustainability, but more so about having products that don't create reactions in their children. And so there's different messaging there you kind of can tailor to those different audiences because the need case and how they're using your product is different. Even though the product is still the same that they're using, the reason why they're choosing it is different.
I like that. And that reminds me, we had an email marketer on, and he talked about on the pop-up form on all the Shopify sites he works with, they always ask like 2 questions. And so they, in addition to email, it'll be like, which of these things are you sort of trying to accomplish? And like some sort of question to get to like, what does winning look like? And so to your point there, it could be like, why did you pick Drops? Is it sustainability? Is it sensitivity? Is it ease of delivery or whatever? And then you can very clearly segment your emails the same way you would segment messaging by ads by geo. You could segment emails by that same kind of concept. Very cool. I want to go back to something you said earlier because you're the first person who's ever mentioned Substack on here. How are you seeing Substack be used successfully and sort of where do you see the opportunities there?
So I think it's almost like it's bringing back blogs that used to be like, so like blogs used to be a place where people would go to get content. Then it became a place where like brands would have blogs as a way for SEO purposes solely, right? And then now it's more kind of like now either where the thought leaders or even brands are able to kind of launch their own kind of Substack pages. Whether it be like in some place, it could be a place for a founder to kind of talk about things. And it's more of a way to kind of like, and people are opting into them, right? So it's almost like they're opting in to be part of these newsletters. And so what I think will be interesting, but like there's no pay for play. I mean, so from that perspective, you can obviously charge people to get the content or get premium content, but there's no like formal ad space on there. And so what I think will be interesting is like how people can affiliate with those people who are on there to kind of put their brands out there and still like pay commission, those type of ways that you do affiliate partners. But it's another space that's not traditionally social. It's not like, it's almost like people view it as very authentic because essentially people are writing and providing content, providing thought leadership there, whether it be brands or whether it be, independent people, but having partnerships with brands who either sponsor posts or any of those type of things and what that looks like going forward. It's still early, but I do think it's a challenge to kind of look at when you think about that's not just like, oh, let's add things on TikTok, like which everyone talks about, or like, like App Lovin' was like a big thing that everyone talked about, like, like last year. And it's like, these are all things that like people are paying to play on. And so how do you I think what will be very interesting is that we as consumers are very much cognizant of the fact that people are paying for things. Influencers don't have the same level of impact because they're essentially paid to talk about your products. And so how do what will actually be successful or kind of deviate through the noise is like people feeling like an authentic connection and things that people are recommending things authentically. Yes, they may get paid and get commission for it, but it's I think Substack presents itself as an opportunity for that to happen. I haven't seen anyone who's done it well, like like very strong do well in terms of like those partnerships. But I think it's going to be interesting, like I would say within a year or two, like what Substack looks like, because they're clearly not. They're very much been very adamant about like not having kind of the paid advertising space formally, but there's an informal way to kind of break through that. And so it'll be interesting how brands play into that space.
That's interesting. Yeah, when you mentioned it, the first thing that came to mind was how god awful so many brands' blogs were for so long, where it'd be like 400 words with nothing really interesting, no real value, and you could tell like either they were doing it because they thought they had an SEO play here, or they were doing it because they just thought they were supposed to have a blog. And it isn't, you're right, it is interesting to think about like, okay, is it, the founder who tries to build this connection and leans into sort of personal brand? Is it a Substack from the company, but putting sort of different faces with different writers forward to show like, hey, this is who we are? Does it come anonymous? Like, no human face, but just the brand. It is interesting to think about, like, is this a second chance at sort of content marketing for some of these e-com brands? Is that something you've kind of like pushed people towards, or do you think it makes more sense to like use it to build upon, like, hey, I already have a successful Substack, maybe I should also launch an e-com product? Or do you think of it more as like, hey, I'm launching this e-com product, maybe Substack's a way to find some niche audiences and build connection?
I view it as the latter. So I view it as like if I'm launching a new brand or I have an existing brand, is a platform, if it makes sense for a brand to actually be on there. And then the other is like, is it a platform that I can partner with people who are already on there who have an audience to kind of that makes it more sense. So if there's a person that's a health and wellness person in terms of Substack and I'm launching like something in that space, or I have a brand that's in that space, how do I kind of get that connection there? Because what's interesting is like, it's a platform that people are opting into, right? So if you think about traditional kind of influencers, they either kind of span in terms of creating content on Meta or they span on like YouTube content, right? And so there's kind of like, on Meta, there's less, depending on what they're kind of doing. Sometimes it's just them posting a picture with the product and then saying, I use it, right? There's no real kind of dialogue. There's no real kind of talking how I use it. There's no real kind of conversation happening. Whereas Substack kind of allows you to talk a little bit more. And not just have the kind of the product that's secondary. So like you were talking about your lifestyle and how you kind of incorporate the product. So I think that's the way I kind of look at it, is like it's more subtle introductions versus kind of overt place where we live in, where like at this point as a consumer, I don't really believe like someone's actually even using the products that you're talking about, right? Now it will eventually, if it does end up happening, it'll end up going in that direction eventually. But I think because it's so early, I think there's a lot of room to kind of have a more authentic connection versus when we're like, it's very clear someone just got paid to talk about this product. So you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's almost like the market keeps trying to find a place that's safe from brands and they can just authentically connect with people, and marketers just kind of keep chasing them and like ruining it and being like, oh, you found Instagram? Well, we're running ads now. Oh, you got TikTok?
Yeah, exactly.
Here's ads. Oh man. Okay. The other thing, so on the LinkedIn for the consulting team, for T Blacksmith Consulting, it talks about being fractional or interim leadership for transitioning teams or teams in a transition. What are some of those big transition areas where you guys find yourselves coming in and providing value other than, kind of initial launch?
So transition would be like either you kind of reach a stump in terms of your growth and you kind of need like a marketing leader kind of to help out there. And then in terms of interim usually comes in a place of like larger companies who like, they may be someone who's left on leave or someone who is, just recently resigned and they kind of need still like leadership to kind of maintain until they fill it full time. And so those are kind of the opportunities to come along in terms of those roles.
And then when you come on, at whatever stage an engagement looks like, what are some of the biggest, like the consistent pain points you're seeing across brands right now?
I mean, it's across the board. Even if I come on or not, it's more about like acquisition costs are too high. How do we kind of grow and scale profitably. In some cases, if they're subscription brand, it could be like, retention and churn and kind of maintaining that. But I think it's the general problems that most e-commerce brands have is like our acquisition costs have increasing, which is, I mean, it's true across the board because the cost of, especially if you're primarily on Meta, like the cost of doing that's increased significantly. And so um how do we view what a direct consumer and e-commerce actually looks for us as a brand? Is it kind of a channel that's reached maturity and then we're kind of just maintaining it? But also what the expectations of growth are. And I think like what I'll say is like I've been in e-commerce for a long period of time. And so like and also been during the scale of like when growth happened, like during the pandemic. And so there was a lot of acceleration that kind of happened that probably would have taken, 5 years to actually happen in like 1 or 2 years. And so because of that, a lot of brands kind of planned for that growth to kind of continue. It didn't anticipate like, oh, this is kind of temporary. And you see that across the board, like even not just in e-com, but just brands that kind of grew in scale, like whether it be in health and wellness, fitness, and like at-home fitness and stuff like that during a period of time. And so a lot of that's been the past few years have been a lot about right sizing that and it's kind of right sizing what the expectations I do see are, understanding that like it's not going to grow to the same trajectory that it did, between 2020 and 2021. But also sometimes some of these brands didn't have the right economics business strategy to, e-com. So while the top line was great, the bottom line was horrible. And so getting to a point where like profitability is actually key. If they're not profitable already, it's been like a key focus point even prior to me being independent.
That's really interesting. So how much do most of the brands you've worked with or people you've spoken with, how much are the marketers kind of involved in, that difference between top line and bottom line, right? And thinking about COGS, understanding and trying to optimize some of the cost points, whether it be, do we test around shipping and free shipping thresholds? Do we test around like bundling? Like how much are you seeing that be like a marketing function versus some sort of operations or finance function?
So the COGS primarily have always sat on the operations side. I would say like things like testing shipping, promotion strategy is usually a collaboration between marketing and finance. And so to understanding like how this actually affects our bottom line. Now I would say there was a period of time like years ago where that wasn't the case. Like marketers would just run whatever, like whatever promotion things that they ran, and then it was all good and glory. And I think but in order to kind of have a successful kind of brand kind of growing and scale requires a kind of tight relationship between the marketing team and finance. And also like I think the role of marketers has also changed, and I think it's as a whole, not even just in e-commerce, right? There was a world where like people just focused more on the brand marketing. It was just like if something looks pretty and everyone celebrated that, and then there wasn't really metrics tied to it. And so being a data-driven marketer is kind of important in this day and age to understand like, okay, yes, it's great. The top line look like this, but how much money did we actually net out at the end of that? What does that look like? Are we actually making money off of, on a monthly basis? If we're not, like, sure, top line is growing, but we're growing at a point where like, we're acquiring customers who are looking for discounts all the time, which is not sustainable. And so it requires like a close collaboration, both between marketing and finance teams.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Every single bit of that, to be honest. But I want to focus on the part you were talking about with the transitioning role of marketers. Yeah, I think I very much lived through that kind of transition where it became like the growth marketer bit of like, we should be able to have like optimizing for ROAS. We should be able to have a metric for every single thing we do and everything's measurable. It feels like we're in many ways sort of the pendulum starting to swing back a little bit now where everyone is talking about brand. And I mean, we spent most of this conversation talking about brand and positioning. And certainly pricing is a large portion of positioning, and pricing is a large portion of your brand. But, building a brand, building an authentic connection is inherently harder to measure. Whether you use an NPS or something like that, which has its own whole set of flaws, you're going to have a weird selection bias if you just go off of surveys and reviews. Like as we kind of think about building a brand, with you as a data-driven marketer, how do you kind of think about trying to put metrics to things like brand, like design, like feeling or connection or something like that? Like, how do you think about the idea of like everything should be measurable in one extreme to like marketing is about creating a feeling where's the sweet spot, and how do you kind of address all of those?
So it's interesting because there has been like a pendulum shift, right? And so there was a period of time, especially with why e-commerce was so like great and kind of grew and like everyone was so excited about it is because like everything was so measurable, right? You could able to go Google Analytics or whatever your platform was, you'd be able to see what the conversion rate was, seeing what the ROAS is. But it also forced us and put us in a position where like we valued and overvalued things that were easily measurable, right? And so because it was easily measurable, because it was being able to get captured, so like it was like, oh, okay, this, our CAC is this, our ROAS is this, and we would just solely emphasized it to the point that we weren't willing to do anything if it didn't have immediate like return on ad spend or return ROI that we can calculate. So which is great in the short term because like you're optimizing for conversion, you're getting all the things that are bringing in the money today, but then all these brands reach a stalemate when like they haven't been building and cultivating a relationship and they haven't been building the pipeline for a year or several months. So yes, brand activities aren't as easily measurable because the life cycle in terms of which someone actually converts could be months, it could be a year. But I think there are other ways to kind of look at it. So if you're talking about direct consumer brands, like, well, what is the percentage of our revenue that's coming from direct traffic and organic traffic as a foundation? That kind of tells you things are happening outside the ecosystem, whether it be outside performance marketing or growth marketing, what we generally talk about. We want people to come to our brands naturally, not necessarily directly from an ad. And so that kind of tells, you can measure that over time to see like, how's that growing or scaling? How's our traffic growing and scaling those channels? Those are things that you can directly tie to like outside campaigns and branding that's not necessarily directly measurable. There are other ways to do it, whether it be like, if you want to test, like, depending on what brand you're selling, like email signups. Like, are you getting more people to sign up to email, SMS, and those type of things based on traffic that is coming from these kind of channels to kind of scale and understand where how these brand activities are kind of working. I mean, the end result is like the whole thing is you want your revenue to kind of grow, right? Like at the end of the day. And so like this doesn't become a conversation that anyone's really having if your revenue is growing, right? And so the challenge becomes, it's like when you're looking at budgets and you're restricting it, it's like, okay, well, this brand thing didn't turn around anything within a month, so it didn't work. The reality is that the customers that you may have reached may not be purchasing for another 6 months. And you don't really know where you are in the consideration cycle, the people who actually saw your brand campaign. Now, it doesn't mean to like spend money frivolously, but I think there are ways to kind of measure that. As I talk about direct consumer, I said like organic and direct traffic. Those are different ways to kind of measure things that like are happening in the ecosystem that are not necessarily coming from a paid ad.
I think I just wrote down like 8 quotes that I just absolutely loved. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Like I've been on that team, right? Like you don't even have that conversation when top and bottom line are looking good. You're like, we don't need to over focus on measurement. Just keep doing what you're doing. And then as soon as things start to struggle or flatten out, suddenly it's like, okay, everything needs a KPI. Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay. This has been so fun and so interesting. If people want to work with you, or if they want to connect with you, what is the best way that they can do that?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn. So on LinkedIn, I'm on my full name, so Temilola Agbede, and I go by Temi.
Okay, great. We'll put that link in the notes as well. Is there anything else you want to publish? Any parting words you want to leave the listeners with?
I think there's been a lot of things in the news probably in the past year talking about D2C being dead and those type of things. And I think it's not necessarily dead. I think the reality of people consuming making transactions online is increasing as we see from the data. But it's not necessarily like D2C was never a strategy. Like it was a channel in which people made purchases. And so we treat it in the same way that we treated retail, and we treat it like marketplaces. Then we understand like it's a channel which you want to meet people where they are, and you want to be able to kind of get them to convert and also learn about your brand. But your website also serves 2 purposes. One is to obviously transact, but it's also the place that you have the most control in talking about and telling the stories of your brand. And so if you understand that, you can look at D2C as just what it is. It's a sales vehicle for you to kind of portray and talk about your brand, but also get people to ultimately purchase in the easiest way possible. But it's not D2C is not a strategy. It's a channel.
I love that. Okay, great. I mean, that might be the short that we publicized this episode with. That was very succinct and great. Temi, it's been so fun chatting with you.
Likewise.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.